The sun rose slowly over Paris, bathing the cobbled streets in golden light. Marianne, a woman in her 30s with brown hair and green eyes, was preparing for an ordinary day. She lived in a small apartment in the 15th arrondissement, a cozy nest that she shared with her husband Charles and their daughter Sophie, aged 5. Marianne's life was simple but filled with love, despite the financial difficulties that often weighed on the couple. That morning, while preparing breakfast for her family, Marianne heard the postman slip the mail into the mailbox. She wasn't expecting anything in particular, maybe a few bills or advertisements. However, among the usual envelopes, a letter with thick paper and an official appearance caught his attention. The sender was a law firm she didn't know. Intrigued, Marianne carefully opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the printed lines quickly, and suddenly she had to sit up, her legs trembling. The letter informed her that she had just inherited a considerable sum, 1 million euros. The inheritance came from her Aunt Elise, an eccentric woman whom Marianne had little known but whom she had taken care to visit regularly in her retirement home in recent years. Marianne reread the letter several times, unable to believe what she was seeing. 1 million euros. It was a sum that exceeded anything she could have imagined. His thoughts swirled, oscillating between excitement and disbelief. She remembered the vague promises of her Aunt Elise, who always told her that one day she would leave her something important. But Marianne had always thought it would be a family heirloom or a small souvenir, not a fortune. As Charles entered the kitchen, closely followed by a still sleepy Sophie, Marianne instinctively hid the letter. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her to keep this news to herself, at least for now. She needed time to think, to digest this information that would change their lives. The day passed like a fog for Marianne. At work, in the small bookstore where she had been a saleswoman for years, she had difficulty concentrating. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but she put it down to a bad night. In fact, his mind kept wandering, imagining all the possibilities this money could offer them. She thought of Sophie, and of the education they could now offer her without worrying about the costs. She imagined a bigger house, with a garden where her daughter could play. She dreamed of travel, of discoveries, of everything that they had until now denied themselves due to lack of means. But at the same time, a little voice inside her warned her. Money could change people, she knew that. How would this sudden wealth affect their family life? In the evening, back at home, Marianne observed Charles and Sophie with new eyes. They were his family, his world. She didn't want money to change that. Still, she knew she would have to tell them, and soon. But not tonight. Tonight, she wanted to savor the simplicity of their life, appreciate what they had built together without the shadow of this unexpected fortune. The following days were a balancing act for Marianne. She juggled her normal life with her thoughts about the inheritance, looking for the right moment to tell Charles about it. She began to do discreet research on wealth management, safe investments, ways to make this money grow to ensure their future. A week after receiving the letter, Marianne decided it was time to share the news with Charles. One evening, after putting Sophie to bed, she sat with him in their little living room. "Charles," she began, her heart pounding, "I have something important to tell you." She took out the letter and handed it to him, watching his face carefully as he read. Charles' eyes widened in surprise, then a broad smile lit up his face. "It's incredible, Marianne," he exclaimed, hugging her. It's incredible luck." Marianne felt relieved by his positive reaction, but she also noticed a glint in his eyes that she had never seen before. They spent much of the night discussing what this inheritance meant to them, what they could do with it. Charles was full of ideas and enthusiasm, talking about quitting his job, buying a big house, traveling the world. Marianne, more cautious, suggested investing a large part of the money and not radically changing their lifestyle. "But why not?" Charles argued. "We've always lived with so little, we deserve to enjoy a little, right?" Marianne understood his point of view, but something in his tone made her uneasy. It was as if money had already started to change something between them. Over the next few days, Marianne noticed subtle changes in Charles' behavior. He seemed more distant, often lost in thought. He started making remarks about their neighbors, about how better their lives were now. Marianne tried to temper her enthusiasm, emphasizing the importance of remaining discreet and thinking carefully before making important decisions. Despite their efforts to keep the inheritance a secret, the news began to spread among those around them. Charles' family, in particular, suddenly seemed much more interested in their lives. Her mother, Rose, who had always had a complicated relationship with Marianne, began calling them more frequently, making thinly veiled hints about the financial help they could provide the family. Marianne felt more and more uncomfortable. The money, which should have been a blessing, seemed to create tensions and expectations that she hadn't anticipated. She found herself almost missing the days when they lived simply, without the weight of this sudden fortune. One evening, when she came home late from work, Marianne surprised Charles on the phone. He spoke in a low voice, in a tone she didn't know. "Yes, don't worry, we'll have the money soon," she heard him say. "I take care of everything." When he saw her, he quickly hung up, claiming it was a work call. But Marianne was not fooled. Something had changed, and she was beginning to fear that it might not be for the better. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the steady breathing of Charles sleeping next to her, Marianne thought. The inheritance, which had seemed to him to be a wonderful opportunity, began to seem like a test for their relationship, their family, and their values. She promised herself to remain vigilant, to protect what really mattered, the love and unity of her little family. As sleep finally took hold of her, Marianne couldn't help but think that the real challenges were only just beginning. Money had the power to change lives, sure, but she was determined that it wouldn't change who they were deep down. With this resolution in mind, she fell asleep, still unaware of the trials that awaited her and the secrets that would soon come to light. The weeks passed, and Marianne's life seemed to oscillate between dream and nightmare. The initial euphoria of the inheritance had faded, giving way to growing anxiety. Charles, once so attentive and present, was becoming more and more distant. His absences multiplied, justified by so-called late meetings at the office or outings with colleagues that dragged on. One evening, while Sophie was sleeping peacefully, Marianne decided to confront Charles. "What's going on?" she asked softly, trying to hide the worry in her voice. "You seem so elsewhere lately." Charles looked up from his phone, surprised. "Nothing at all, darling," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just a little stressed at work, that's all." But Marianne was not fooled. She had known Charles for over 10 years, and never before had he acted this way. The furtive calls, the messages he was quick to hide, the increasingly elaborate excuses for his delays. All of this formed a picture that she refused to accept. It was a rainy Tuesday evening that Marianne discovered the first piece of the puzzle. While putting away Charles' things, she came across a crumpled receipt at the bottom of a pocket. A dinner for two in a chic restaurant in Montmartre, dated an evening when Charles pretended to work late. His heart sank. She wanted to believe in an innocent explanation, but the doubt had already crept in, like a slow poison. Determined to know the truth, Marianne began to investigate discreetly. She noted Charles' schedules, checked bank statements, listened carefully to his telephone conversations. Each new discovery was like a stab. Unexplained cash withdrawals, calls to unknown numbers, increasingly obvious lies about his schedules. One day, while she was shopping, Marianne saw Charles in the street. He was with a woman she didn't know, a beautiful, elegant brunette. They walked side by side, laughing and talking with an intimacy that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Marianne felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She held on to her shopping cart to keep from falling, her heart beating wildly. That night, unable to sleep, Marianne made a decision. She was going to follow Charles, discover the whole truth, as painful as it was. The next morning, after dropping Sophie off at school, she borrowed a friend's car and followed Charles at a distance. The journey took her out of Paris, to a small suburban town that she did not know. Charles stopped in front of a pretty house with a well-kept garden. Marianne saw him enter, greeted by the same woman she had seen the day before. Then, to his amazement, two children came running out, throwing themselves into Charles' arms with joyful cries of "Daddy." Marianne's world collapsed. Charles had another family, another life. Everything they had built together suddenly seemed like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest breath. Trembling, Marianne returned home. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, alternating between tears and cold anger. When Charles came home that evening, she was sitting in the dark living room, waiting for him. "We need to talk," she said simply when he entered. Charles turned on the light, surprised to find it there. "What's going on, honey?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. "I know everything, Charles," Marianne replied, her voice strangely calm. "I saw your family." Charles' face fell. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silence stretched on, heavy with unsaid words and betrayals. "How long has it been?" Marianne finally asked. Charles collapsed into the chair across from her. 5 years, he whispered. "It started as an adventure, and then, I don't know how things got this far." Marianne listened, heartbroken, as Charles unraveled the whole story. How he had met Isabel during a business trip, how an affair had turned into a double life. The children, a boy and a girl, were born shortly after Sophie. "I love you both," Charles pleaded. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." But his words rang hollow in Marianne's ears. Their whole life together now seemed like a lie to him. Birthdays, vacations, shared moments of happiness. Everything was colored by this betrayal. "And the money?" she asked suddenly, a terrible thought crossing her mind. "The legacy, is that why you were so interested?" Charles' guilty silence was response enough. Marianne then understood that her husband had probably planned to use part of the inheritance to provide for the needs of his other family. "I want you to leave," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight. I can't look at you anymore." Charles tried to protest, to explain himself again, but Marianne remained inflexible. That night, she watched him pack his bags and leave the apartment, taking with him the debris of their life together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Marianne. She oscillated between sorrow, anger, and deep weariness. Explaining the situation to Sophie was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do. How do you tell a 5-year-old girl that her father had another family, that he would no longer live with them? Fortunately, Marianne was not alone. His friends rallied, offering moral support and practical help. Her best friend, Lucy, spent several nights on the sofa, watching over Marianne and Sophie. Little by little, Marianne began to see a future beyond this betrayal. The inheritance, which had seemed to be the source of all their problems, paradoxically became a lifeline. Marianne realized that she now had the means to rebuild her life as she wanted, without depending on anyone. She consulted a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings, determined to protect her interests and those of Sophie. The divorce process was quick, with Charles not contesting anything, probably out of guilt. Marianne ensured that the inheritance remained her exclusive property, successfully arguing that it came from her family and had never been involved in the couple's finances. As the summer came to an end, Marianne began to feel a change within herself. The pain was still there, but less severe. She found herself making plans, imagining a new life for Sophie and her. The idea of moving, of leaving this apartment full of memories, began to germinate in his mind. One evening, while tucking Sophie in, her daughter asked her, "Mom, will we always be happy, you and I?" Marianne looked at her daughter, so innocent and so strong at the same time. "Yes, my darling," she replied, feeling a new determination overcome her. "We will be happy. We will build a new life, both of us. A life full of love and adventures." That night, as she lay in bed, Marianne thought about everything that had happened. Charles' betrayal had been a blow, but she now realized that it was also a form of liberation. She no longer had to live in lies, no longer had to worry about secrets and things left unsaid. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Marianne looked toward it with a mixture of excitement and hope. She had survived the storm, and now it was up to her to chart her course. As she began to fall asleep, Marianne had no idea that other challenges awaited her. Life still had surprises in store, some good, some not so much. But one thing was certain: whatever happened, she was ready to face it, stronger and more resilient than ever. Autumn had arrived in Paris, bringing with it a freshness in the air and a swirl of golden leaves in the streets. For Marianne, this new season also marked the start of a new chapter in her life. The divorce from Charles was finalized, and she was just beginning to find a semblance of normality in her daily life with Sophie. One Saturday morning, while Marianne was enjoying a coffee on her small balcony, the phone rang. It was Rose, his mother-in-law, or rather, his ex-mother-in-law now. Marianne hesitated for a moment before answering. His relationship with Rose had always been complicated, and since the revelation of Charles' double life, things were even more tense. "Hello, Marianne?" Rose's voice sounded unusually cheerful. "I hope I don't bother you. I have wonderful news to tell you." Intrigued in spite of herself, Marianne listened to Rose tell her about a house she had just bought. A beautiful property in the south of France, near Aix-en-Provence, with a large garden and swimming pool. Rose described the house enthusiastically, dwelling on every detail, from the marble kitchen to the spacious bedrooms. "That's wonderful, Rose," Marianne said, a little perplexed. "But why tell me all this?" There was silence on the end of the line, then Rose continued, her voice suddenly hesitant. "Well, my dear, I thought that, with your inheritance, you might be able to help me pay it." Marianne felt her heart stop. "Pardon," she said, sure she had heard wrong. "Yes, you know," Rose continued, regaining her confidence, "this is a golden opportunity. I made an offer without thinking, and now, well, I need a little boost. Only 150,000 euros is nothing for you, with your million, is it?" Marianne was stunned. She didn't know what shocked her more, Rose's audacity to have bought a house with someone else's money, or the fact that she seemed to be completely unaware of the situation with Charles. "Rose," Marianne began, trying to keep calm, "I don't know if you know, but Charles and I are divorced. He had another family." It was Rose's turn to be stunned. "What? But that's impossible. Charles would never." "Oh my God." A long and painful conversation followed, where Marianne had to explain in detail Charles' betrayal and the events of the last months. Rose wavered between disbelief, grief and anger, her dream of a home in the south suddenly seeming far away. "But the money," Rose insisted once the initial shock wore off. "You still have it, don't you? You could still help me." Marianne felt anger rising within her. "Rose, this money is for Sophie's future and mine. I can't spend it on a house you bought on a whim." The conversation ended in a tense atmosphere, with Rose abruptly hanging up after accusing Marianne of being selfish and ungrateful. Marianne sat on her balcony for a long time, phone in hand, trying to understand what had just happened. The following days were difficult. Rose multiplied the calls and messages, alternating between supplications and reproaches. She had already made a deposit on the house and was in danger of losing it if she didn't come up with the rest of the money quickly. Marianne felt torn between guilt and frustration. She knew she wasn't responsible for Rose's impulsive decisions, but part of her couldn't help but feel uneasy about leaving her in this situation. One evening, while Sophie was sleeping, Marianne decided to call Lucy to ask her advice. Her friend listened attentively before giving her opinion. "Marianne, you don't have to feel guilty," Lucy said firmly. "Rose is an adult who made an irresponsible decision. It's not your job to fix her mistakes, especially after everything you've been through." These words resonated in Marianne. She realized she had spent too much time trying to please others, meeting their expectations. It was time to think of her and her daughter. The next day, Marianne made a decision. She called Rose one last time. "Rose," she said in a calm but firm voice, "I understand that you are in a difficult situation, but I cannot give you this money. This inheritance is for Sophie's future, and I have the responsibility to manage it responsibly." Rose began to protest, but Marianne continued, "I'm sorry things happened this way. I hope you find a solution, but it won't be with my financial help." After hanging up, Marianne felt both relieved and a little sad. She knew she had made the right decision, but she couldn't help but think about the complicated relationship she had always had with her mother-in-law. Perhaps this situation would mark the definitive end of their bond. The weeks passed, and little by little, Rose's calls became less frequent. Marianne learned through mutual friends that Rose had ultimately had to give up the house, losing her deposit in the process. She felt a pang of guilt, quickly dissipated by the certainty of having acted responsibly. This experience pushed Marianne to think seriously about the future. She realized she needed a concrete plan to manage her inheritance. After some research, she made an appointment with a financial advisor recommended by Lucy. During their first meeting, Marianne explained her situation and her objectives to the advisor, a man in his 50s named Philippe. "I want to secure Sophie's future," she says, "but also have the opportunity to start a new life. Maybe move, change careers." Philippe listened attentively before proposing an action plan. He suggested investing a significant portion of the inheritance in secure long-term investments for Sophie's education, setting aside a sum for the eventual purchase of a new house, and using a small portion to allow Marianne to explore new professional opportunities. "The important thing," Philippe emphasized, "is not to make hasty decisions. You have time to think and plan." These words resonated in Marianne. She realized that since the announcement of the inheritance, she had been caught in a whirlwind of events, reacting to crises rather than acting on her own desires. It was time to take control of his life. In the days that followed, Marianne began to make plans. She considered going back to school, perhaps to become a librarian, a dream she had abandoned years before. She also started looking at real estate ads, imagining a new home for Sophie and her, perhaps in another city, far from the painful memories of Paris. One evening, while she was leafing through university brochures, Sophie came and snuggled up to her on the sofa. "Mom," she asked, "are we going to move?" Marianne looked at her daughter, surprised by her insight. "Maybe, darling. Would you like that?" Sophie thought for a moment before answering. "Yes, I think so. But only if we stay together." Moved, Marianne hugged her daughter. "Of course we stay together. You and me against the whole world, remember?" That night, as she tucked Sophie in, Marianne felt filled with a feeling of peace that she had not known for a long time. There were still many challenges, but for the first time in months, she felt like she had regained control of her life. As she fell asleep, Marianne thought about the future. She didn't know exactly what the future held for her, but she was ready for it. With Sophie at her side and the financial security that the inheritance brought her, she felt capable of overcoming all obstacles. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first of a new life that she would build on her own terms. Winter had settled on Paris, enveloping the city in a white and silent coat. For Marianne, this season brought a feeling of renewal. After months of thinking and planning, she had finally made a decision that would change her and Sophie's lives. They were going to move to Lyon. The choice had not been easy. Marianne had spent entire nights weighing the pros and cons, imagining their new life far from everything they knew. But in the end, the idea of a new beginning, far from the ghosts of the past, won out. One morning in January, as Marianne was finalizing the final details of their move, she received an unexpected call. It was Charles. "Marianne," he said, his voice betraying an unusual nervousness, "we need to talk. It's important." Despite her initial reluctance, Marianne agreed to meet him. They arranged to meet in a small café near the Place de la Bastille, a neutral place where they used to go in the past. When Marianne arrived at the café, Charles was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, looking dejected. When she saw him, she was struck by his appearance. He seemed to have aged 10 years in a few months. "Thanks for coming," Charles said as she sat down across from him. He took a deep breath before continuing. I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Marianne felt her heart speed up. What could be worse than what she already knew? "I'm sick, Marianne," Charles said, looking down at his cup of coffee. "Doctors have diagnosed pancreatic cancer. It's in an advanced stage." The world seemed to stop around Marianne. Despite all the anger and pain Charles had caused her, she couldn't help but feel deep shock at this news. "I'm sorry," Charles continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything, but I wanted you to know." For Sophie. Marianne remained silent for a long moment, trying to digest the information. Finally, she asked, "How long?" 6 months, maybe a year if you're lucky," Charles replied, finally looking up to meet her gaze. Silence settled between them, heavy with unsaid words and regrets. Marianne felt torn between compassion and lingering anger at Charles' lies. "What about your other family?" she finally asked. "Do they know?" Charles nodded. "Yes, they know. It's complicated. Isabel and I separated. She doesn't want to see me anymore. Marianne couldn't help but feel a pang of bitter satisfaction at this news, followed immediately by a feeling of guilt. No one deserved to go through this alone. "What do you want, Charles?" she asked softly. "Why tell me all this now?" Charles took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize, really apologize, for all the hurt I've done to you. And I wanted to ask you if I could see Sophie, from time to time. Before. It's not too late." Marianne felt tears welling up in her eyes. The situation was so complex, so full of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect Sophie from the pain to come. But another part knew that his daughter had the right to spend time with her father, regardless. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "I have to talk to Sophie about it, see what she thinks. And we will have to establish clear rules." Charles nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Marianne. I know I don't deserve your kindness." As she left the cafe, Marianne felt like she was in a fog. She walked the streets of Paris for a long time, trying to put her thoughts and emotions in order. How was she going to tell Sophie this? How were they going to handle this situation with their impending move? The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult discussions. Marianne took the time to explain the situation to Sophie, as gently and honestly as possible. The little girl had difficulty understanding all the implications, but she expressed a desire to see her father. After long reflections and discussions with Lucy and her therapist, Marianne made a decision. She agreed to allow Charles to see Sophie regularly, but with strict conditions. The visits would be supervised, at least initially, and Charles would have to commit to being honest with Sophie about his situation. The move to Lyon was postponed for a few months. Marianne knew it was the right thing to do, giving Sophie the opportunity to spend time with her father while preparing for their new life. The weeks that followed were strange and emotional. Marianne watched Sophie and Charles slowly rebuild their relationship, aware that every moment was precious. Despite her initial reluctance, she couldn't help but be touched by Charles' efforts to be present and honest with their daughter. One evening, after a particularly moving visit, Sophie snuggled up against Marianne on the sofa. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm glad we stayed a little longer in Paris." Marianne hugged her daughter against her, feeling her heart tighten. "Me too, darling." As the weeks went by, Marianne was surprised to find that Charles' presence in their life, although difficult, brought an unexpected form of closure. Seeing Charles take responsibility for his actions, striving to be a better father in the time he had left, helped Marianne heal some of her wounds. One day, while she accompanied Charles to the hospital for one of his treatments, he turned to her with a serious look. "Marianne," he said, "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For your kindness, your strength. I know that I can never repair all the harm I did, but I want you to know how much I am grateful for these moments with Sophie." Marianne felt tears get her eyes. "Charles," she replied gently, "I don't do that for you. I do it for Sophie, and, for me too, in a way. So that we can all move forward." Charles nodded, including, "You have always been the best of us, Marianne. Sophie is lucky to have you." These words, although painful, brought Marianne a feeling of peace that she had not felt for a long time. She realized that forgiveness, even in the most difficult situations, could be liberating. While spring was starting to point the tip of her nose in Paris, Marianne and Sophie were finally preparing for their move to Lyon. Charles' health had deteriorated quickly, and he was now in palliative care. The farewells were heartbreaking, but imbued with a certain serenity. The day before their departure, Marianne stood on the balcony of their Parisian apartment, looking at the city to sparkle in the night. She thought of everything that had happened since this letter that had changed everything: heritage, betrayal, Charles' disease, moments of doubt and fear, but also moments of grace and forgiveness. She realized that money, which had seemed to be the source of all their problems, was in reality only a catalyst. He had highlighted the cracks already present in their lives, but he also offered the possibility of a new start. Tomorrow, Marianne and Sophie would leave for Lyon, towards a new life full of promises and uncertainties. They left behind a complicated past, but also a form of reconciliation that they would never have thought possible. While Marianne closed the door of their apartment for the last time, she felt a mixture of sadness and hope to invade her. Whatever the future has in store for them, she knew they were ready to face it together, stronger and wiser thanks to the tests they had gone through. The trip to Lyon was not only a geographic trip, it was the beginning of a new chapter in their life. A chapter where the inheritance would no longer be a burden or a source of conflict, but a tool to build the future they deserved. The train spun across the French campaign, carrying Marianne and Sophie towards their new life in Lyon. Sitting near the window, Marianne observed the landscape scrolling, her thinking as moving as the images that passed her eyes. She thought about the last months, to everything that had changed since this famous letter announcing the inheritance. Besides her, Sophie was sleeping peacefully, her little hand tight around the plush that Charles had offered her during their last meeting. Marianne felt her heart tightening thinking about these heartbreaking farewells. Despite all the evil that Charles had done, these last shared moments had been imprinted with sincere emotion and unexpected forgiveness. The train stopped in a small campaign station, and Marianne was taken from her reflections by the bustle on the quay. She saw a family get on board, the parents responsible for luggage, followed by two excited children. This scene suddenly reminded him of Rose, her mother-in-law, and the episode of the house in the south. Marianne had not heard from Rose since their last stormy conversation. She wondered how the old lady had managed the loss of her deposit and the failure of her real estate project. A part of her was still guilty of not having helped, but she knew basically that she had made the right decision. As the train resumed her journey, Marianne released her notebook. In recent weeks, she had used to record her thoughts, fears, and hopes. It was a way for her to take stock, to give meaning to everything that had happened. She began to write, "Dear newspaper, here we are on the way to Lyon, Sophie and I. It is strange to leave Paris behind us, to say goodbye to a life that I thought I was immutable a few months ago. Aunt Elise's inheritance has changed everything, but not the way I imagined it. I thought that this money would be a blessing without mixing, the key to an easier life. Instead, he was the revealing of cracks that I did not even suspect in my life. The betrayal of Charles, the expectations of Rose, my own doubts and fears. Everything has been amplified, highlighted by this sudden fortune. But today, while we are heading for our new life, I realize that this inheritance was also a catalyst for necessary changes. Without him, would I have had the courage to leave my comfort zone, to start from scratch in a new city? Would I have discovered this strength in me, this ability to overcome adversity and make difficult decisions? I think of Charles, his illness, these last shared moments. The pain is still there, but it is different now. There is a form of acceptance, perhaps even forgiveness. Not for him, but for me. To be able to move forward without the weight of resentment. And Sophie, my little Sophie sleeping next to me, unconscious of the torments of adults. She has shown incredible resilience in the face of all these changes. I hope that one day, when she is bigger, she will understand that everything I did it for her, to offer us a new start." Marianne stopped writing for a moment, looking at her daughter tenderly. She resumed her pen. "Lyon awaits us with its promises and uncertainties. I chose this city for its dynamism, its opportunities, but also for the distance it offers with our past. Far enough to start again, but not too much for Sophie to keep a link with his father, as long as there is still time. Inheritance money gives us security, that's true. But I now realize that its true value lies in the freedom it offers us. The freedom to choose our way, to take risks, to reinvent us. I have projects in my head. Return to my studies, maybe open my own bookstore one day. Dreams that I had put aside and now seem at hand. But I also know that I have to be careful, not repeating Rose's mistakes. This money is a responsibility, not just a privilege. I also think of Lucy, her unwavering support during these difficult months. Our friendship was put to the test, but it came out stronger. She promised to come and visit us in Lyon as soon as we are installed. It is reassuring to know that certain links persist despite the distance. As for Rose, I wonder what becomes. Despite our disputes, I can't help but worry about it. Perhaps one day, when the injuries are less lively, we can reconnect. For now, I need to focus on our new start. The train slows down to enter a new station. Marianne looked up with her notebook, observing the travelers who rose and descended. Everyone with their own story, their own struggles and hopes. She suddenly felt connected to this moving humanity, sharing this moment of transition. She resumed her writing. This train trip is like a metaphor for our life in recent months. We are moving forward, leaving behind familiar landscapes to discover new ones. There are moments of calm, like now, when we can think, do the point. I wonder what the future has in store for us in Lyon. How will Sophie adapt to her new school? Will I manage to make new friends, to build a new network? And if I launched myself into this bookstore project, would I be up to the challenge? All these questions scare me, but it is a fear mixed with excitement. For the first time for a long time, I feel alive, ready to face the unknown. The inheritance of Aunt Elise is not only financial, it is also an inheritance of courage. She has always lived her life in her own words, without worrying about what we will say. Maybe it's time that I follow his example. I look at Sophie and I see in her all this potential, all these possibilities. I want to show him that we can overcome the trials, that we can reinvent ourselves. I want her to grow up knowing that the value of a person is not measured on their bank account, but to their ability to love, to forgive, to get up after each fall. This inheritance, ultimately, is much more than a sum of money. It is a lesson in life, an opportunity to grow and evolve. It is a new chapter that we write together, Sophie and me. Marianne closed her notebook as the train was approaching Lyon. The sky darkened, the first lights of the sparkling city in the distance. She slowly shook Sophie to wake her up. "Look, my darling," she said slowly, "it's Lyon. Our new house." Sophie rubbed her eyes and looked out the window, her lighting face with wonder in front of the city's light show. As the train entered the station, Marianne felt a mixture of apprehension and hope invading her. She did not know exactly what the future reserved for them, but she was ready to face her. With Sophie by her side and the lessons of the last months engraved in her heart, she felt stronger than ever. The train stopped. It was time. Marianne took a deep inspiration, shook Sophie's hand, and got up. Together, they made their first steps towards their new life, leaving behind the weight of the past and embracing the promises of the future. Lyon welcomed them, vast and unknown, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Marianne really felt at home. The sun rose in Lyon, bathing the quays of the Saône with a soft golden light. Marianne, standing in front of the window of her new apartment, observed the city awakening. She has been moving here for 6 months now, and every day brought her share of discoveries and challenges every day. The apartment, located in the Croix-Rousse district, was more spacious than the one they had left in Paris. The high ceilings and the large windows gave an impression of space and freedom which corresponded perfectly to their new state of mind. On the living room wall, a large map of Lyon was hung, dotted with colored bedbugs marking the places they had already explored and those they planned to visit. Marianne headed for the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As she took out the bowls, she heard Sophie's light steps in the corridor. "Hello, Mom," said the little girl when he entered the kitchen, her ruffled hair and her tight cuddly. "Hello, my chip," replied Marianne, kissing her. "Draft well?" Sophie nodded, settling down at the table. "I dreamed that we were flying above Lyon," she said with a big smile. Marianne laughed slowly. It had to be a beautiful dream. "Ready for your school day?" Sophie's adaptation to her new school had been easier than Marianne had not feared. The little girl had made friends quickly and adored her mistress, Mrs. Dubois, a warm woman who had managed to welcome her with kindness. While Sophie ate her breakfast, Marianne consulted her agenda. The day promised was loaded. She had an appointment with her financial advisor in the morning, then a course at the university in the afternoon. After long reflections, she had decided to resume studies in business management, with the idea of realizing her dream of opening a bookstore. Once Sophie was deposited at school, Marianne went to her appointment. Philippe, his advisor, welcomed him with a warm smile. "So, Marianne, how is this new life going in Lyon?" he asked after the usual greetings. "It's different," replied Marianne. "Exciting and a little scary at the same time. But I feel that it was the right decision." They spent the next time to discuss the state of its finances and its projects. The heritage, cautiously invested, assured them comfortable security. But Marianne was determined not to depend only on this money. I made progress on my bookstore project, she explained to Philippe. I spotted a potential room in the second arrondissement. It is a bit expensive, but the location is ideal. Philippe nodded, thoughtful. It's a beautiful project, Marianne. But don't forget that setting up a business still has risks. Are you sure you are ready? Marianne reflects a moment before answering. I know it will not be easy, but after all that happened, I think I need this challenge. To build something that really belongs to me. Leaving Philippe's office, Marianne felt both excited and anxious. The bookstore project was no longer a simple distant dream, it began to take shape, to become real. In the afternoon, at the university, Marianne plunged into her lessons with enthusiasm. At 35, she was older than most of her comrades, but that didn't bother her. On the contrary, she appreciated the richness of exchanges, the mixture of generations and experiences. During a break between two lessons, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Lucy. Hello my beautiful. I reserved my ticket to come and see you next month. I can't wait to discover your new life. Marianne smiles, touched by the loyalty of her friend. Despite the distance, Lucy had remained constant support, always ready to listen to it and encourage it. In the evening, after recovering Sophie at school and prepared dinner, Marianne settled in the living room with a book. Sophie played quietly with her Lego, building what looked like a miniature replica of the Fourvier Basilica. Mom, said Sophie suddenly, raising the eyes of her construction, do you think Papa sees us up there? Marianne felt her heart tightening. Charles died 2 months after their move to Lyon. Despite the complexity of their history, her disappearance had been a shock, especially for Sophie. I'm sure he looks at us, darling, said Marianne slowly. And I'm sure he's very proud of you. Sophie nodded, seeming to be satisfied with this answer, and returned to her Lego. Marianne observed it for a moment, amazed by the resilience of children. Later in the evening, once Sophie lying down, Marianne went out on the small balcony of the apartment. The city stretched in front of it, an ocean of sparkling lights. She thought back to the path traveled from this famous letter announcing the heritage. So much had changed. Charles' betrayal, divorce, illness, move. Each test had left its mark, but also made it stronger. The inheritance, which at first seemed to him to be a source of problems, had finally revealed to be an opportunity to rediscover himself, to reinvent himself. The next morning, Marianne got up early, determined to move forward on her bookstore project. After depositing Sophie at school, she went to the second arrondissement to see the premises she had spotted. Standing in front of the empty window, Marianne let her imagination wander. She already visualized the shelves filled with books, a comfortable corner for children's readings, maybe even a small coffee space. Are you interested in the local? A voice died from her reverie. She was a woman in her 50s, with a warm smile. Yes, replied Marianne. I would like to open a bookstore. Oh, how wonderful, exclaimed the woman. My name is Genevieve. I hold the bakery right next to it. A bookstore would be perfect in the neighborhood. Marianne and Genevieve began to discuss, and soon, they were sitting on the terrace of a neighboring coffee, sharing their experiences and their hopes for the neighborhood. You know, said Genevieve by sipping her coffee, opening my business was not easy. There were times when I wanted to give up everything. But when I see my customers smile while tasting my croissants, I know it was worth it. These words resonated in Marianne. She realized that her bookstore project was not only a personal adventure, but also a way to integrate into her new community, to create links, to share her passion. Going home that evening, Marianne felt more determined than ever. She knew that the path would be long and difficult, but for the first time for a long time, she felt like she had found her way. As she helped Sophie do her homework, her phone rang. It was a number that she did not know. Hello, she replied, intrigued. Marianne. The voice at the other end of the wire was hesitant. It's Pink. Marianne felt her heart accelerating. She had not spoken to her ex-beautiful mother for months. Rose. How are you? There was a silence, then Rose resumed, I wanted to apologize, Marianne. For everything. I was selfish and unfair to you. The conversation that followed was long and moving. Rose told her how she had finally sold her house in Paris to repay her debts, how she had to face her own demons after the death of Charles. "I understand now," said Rose, the trembling voice. "Money cannot solve all the problems. I learned that at my expense." After hanging up, Marianne remained a motionless moment, overwhelmed by emotion. This unexpected conversation seemed to close a chapter of his life, finally allowing him to completely turn the page. That evening, lying in her bed, Marianne is thinking about everything that had happened since the announcement of the inheritance. The trials, the tears, but also the moments of joy and discovery. She thought of Sophie, who flourished in her new school. To his bookstore project, which was taking shape day after day. To this new life that they built together in Lyon. Aunt Elise's inheritance had been much more than money. He had been the catalyst for a deep change, the opportunity to redefine what really counted. Tomorrow would be a new day, filled with challenges and possibilities. And for the first time for a long time, Marianne had been looking forward to her impatiently and serenity. Whatever the future has in store for her, she now knew that she had the strength to face him. As sleep won her, Marianne smiled in the dark. Life may not always be easy, but it was finally on the path she had chosen. And that, more than all the money in the world, was true wealth.